Republicans are about to realize one of their long-held desires to get rid of NPR and PBS, or at least to stop so much federal money going to them. Now, it's a much more complicated issue than you might think, and that's why I wanted to explain it pretty thoroughly here so that you understood what Congress is doing and why they're doing it. Okay, so there are two things here. The big picture is that the Senate, controlled by Republicans, and soon the House, controlled by Republicans, are going to do something called rescissions. Now, you don't need to worry about that word. All it means is they are basically going to try to claw back money that the federal government, the Congress, had already allocated to places and institutions, get that back in hopes of reducing some of the debt and deficit issues this country is facing. I will note parenthetically, the one big beautiful bill, which this same Congress passed less than a month ago, will add $3+ trillion to the national debt. Okay, but the point here is to get some of that money back. So what we're talking about in total is $9 billion, that's billion with a B, $9 billion. It's a tiny fraction of what the federal government spends. Most of that money, about $8 billion, is for foreign aid assistance. These are things like USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, things that Trump has made a priority to zero out. So that's $8 billion. About $1 billion, $1.1 billion, is money that is allocated to an organization called the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is sort of this umbrella organization that includes PBS, NPR, and more than 1,000 local radio and TV stations around the country. So I'll get into that in a sec, but let's just deal with this spending issue first. Remember that in the Constitution, how the federal government spends money and on what is assigned as a duty to the legislative branch. Okay? That's what they do. They hold the legit purse strings of how money gets spent by the federal government. This is very clearly an attempt by the executive branch. This is Donald Trump's idea to say, let's get this money back. Why are we spending money on these things? Let's get it back. And Congress, who again is supposed to be in charge of making the decisions on what gets spent and what doesn't get spent, saying, okay, President Trump, we will go along with you. So the big 50,000-foot issue here is this is yet another example of the legislative branch caving to the executive branch. The President Trump expanding the powers of the executive, Congress, controlled by Republicans, willingly giving up their power, taking orders on spending and cutting from the President of the United States. All right, that's a 50,000-foot view. And before I get to the sort of PBS and NPR of all of this, I want to say one thing. I want you to subscribe to this channel. We are growing fast, and I think we're growing fast because people are drawn to someone who is an independent. I'm independent from big legacy media. I don't have a billionaire boss. I don't have a corporate conglomerate behind me. I'm also independent from the two parties. I will tell you how it is no matter what. I am not a partisan. I am not an activist. I am a journalist, and I promise to always give you my honest and authentic take on the news and the political news of the day. Okay, so let's talk about PBS, NPR, and what's going on here. So again, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is this umbrella group that helps fund NPR, PBS, and a lot of local radio and TV stations. It was established in 1967 by then President Lyndon Johnson. I want to read you something that he said in explaining why he thought this was important. This is Lyndon Johnson. It will give a wider and I think stronger voice to educational radio and TV by providing new funds for broadcast facilities. Okay, that was Lyndon Johnson in 1967. Now let's fast forward to today. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting gets about $500 million in federal money a year from the federal government. Okay, it's a lot of money, $500 million. What I will say is that Republicans have long argued that this is ridiculous for a couple reasons. Why are we publicly funding media? Why is the government paying for media? And two, why is the government paying for media that clearly leans to the left? And broadly speaking, I sort of agree on NPR. PBS, I'm a little less convinced of, but I do think NPR tends to lean to the left. There was obviously a famous op-ed written by a guy who used to work at NPR named Yuri Berliner, saying like everybody here is a Democrat. Effectively, he now works for the Free Press and Barry Weiss. So I think Republicans have long said, why are we funding this, A? And then B, why are we funding it? Because it also leans very clearly to the left. I think they exaggerate that lean to the left, but that's the argument. And it's like, okay, so I think a lot of people see these votes, the Senate vote, the House vote, and they think, oh, well, NPR and PBS are going to disappear. No. Now, that is not what's going to happen here, right? And in fact, I think in some ways, Republicans may be cutting off their own nose to spite their constituents' face. Let me explain it to you. So, as I said, $500 million Corporation for Public Broadcasting every year. Most that gets spent on PBR, NPS, and NPR, PBS, and local stations. Too many acronyms. You know how much of that money comprises NPR's budget? 2%. 2% of NPR's budget comes from all federal grants, not just the money from Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That's probably actually a smaller percentage, but 2% of NPR. So 98% of NPR's money comes from not the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. NPR is going to survive, people. The PBS budget is a little bit more dependent on federal grants, 15%. Still, 85% of the money that PBS gets is not from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the federal government, or any other grants from the government. 85%. Here, which, by the way, PBS will also survive. Now, I think NPR will have to adjust. I mean, 2% of your budget isn't nothing. At PBS certainly will have to adjust. 15% of your budget isn't nothing. But we are not talking about zeroing out NPR and PBS. That will not happen. And I would suggest individual donors will probably make up that 2%. I don't know if they'll make up the 15% for PBS, but I would guess they'll make up the 2% for NPR. Okay, so what is the actual practical impact then of what Congress is doing at Donald Trump's behest in terms of taking $1.1 billion away from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting? Well, in 2011, now it's 2011, 15 years ago, NPR did a study. And what they found is this. If Congress cut off federal spending to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which they are going to do, 1 in 5 of the 1,000 local member channels would be forced to close. So we're talking about 200-ish local channels, whether that's radio or TV, would be forced to close. 3 in 10 people in the country would lose access to NPR programming. So what does that mean? Well, the study also found that it would disproportionately affect people in the Midwest, South, and the West. That's a lot of Republican territory there. So we already live in a lot of news deserts where there just is not a major news outlet covering large swaths of this country. This is going to add to those news deserts. Now, the pushback from Marjorie Taylor Greene and other conservatives who very much favor this is we have the internet now. You don't need to have TV or radio access. You can have the internet. You can search whatever you want. True-ish, but I would also say, the internet. First of all, not everybody has access to the internet. We know that. And second of all, the internet is very focused, at least in the political and policy world, very focused on national news, much less focused on local news. And so I'm not sure that it's a one-for-one filling of that void. The other thing I just want to make a point on, NPR and PBS, the national NPR and PBS, they do not dictate what runs on local channels. Within sort of this umbrella of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Those channels make their own decisions with their own either, program director or TV director. They make their own decisions. Now, they can buy the right, these local stations can buy the rights for bigger national NPR or PBS programming, PBS NewsHour, for example, but they're not required to. And again, they make their own decisions. So here's the deal. I know that conservatives really do not like PBS and NPR. Fine. I just think that what is happening here, and you need to understand this is not going to mean that when you go to NPR, national NPR, that most of you in this country will still be able to hear it. You'll still be able to watch PBS. Again, 2% of NPR's budget is from federal grants that will be taken away. 15%, not nothing, but still 15%, not 15% of PBS's budget. This will most impact local TV and radio stations under the Corporation for Public Broadcasting umbrella. Those organizations do not take their marching orders from national NPR or national PBS, and they are free to cover whatever they like. I think the big loser here is the news consumer, because yes, we have the internet, but what if that's not your preferred method of consuming news? What if the internet isn't covering a local issue that's important to you? We're going to get less news coverage out of this, and I think that ultimately hurts the average news consumer. PBS, NPR, yeah, they're going to have to make some changes, but you know what? They're going to continue on. They're probably going to be just fine. Those more local stations, they're going to be more hard hit, and that's going to bleed down to less reporters having jobs and a public being less informed. And I think that is a bad thing, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or whatever party you identify with. That's it for me today. I always ask you subscribe, as I did earlier. Independent, calling balls and strikes no matter what uniform the batter at the plate is wearing. That is me. I hope you can get behind it. I also would love if you can like and comment on this video. Helps us build community. Also helps us get content, this sort of content, out to people who are not already subscribers to my channel. Last thing, tell a friend or a colleague or a coworker about what I'm doing here and why you think it's important. Word of mouth matters. Be an evangelist, even if you're already a subscriber. All right, everyone, take care.